Demography, we are very pleased to inform that Professor Massimo Livi Bacci accepted the invitation to travel all the way from Italy to be here with us today. He's a Professor Emeritus of Demography of the University of Florence, and he was Chief of the Department of Statistics, Computer and Applications, Giuseppe Parenti. He's studied at great length the history of demography with particular attention to Europe and the participation of the American continent during the colonial era, and about more contemporaneous issues such as population, social policies, and immigration. Among some of his books that have been translated in several languages, we have the minimum history of the world's population, the European population, conquer and destruction of the American population, and the history of immigration. I am very pleased to inform that he accepted the invitation to be here at this colegio today, going away from home, but I'm also very pleased to say that we agree when we planned the seminar that this Magister conference would be provided by a demographers, not only because I am one myself, but also because such like the Science Academy that was just published last month would say, population is the great elephant that nobody sees when we're discussing the 2030 agenda. So I believe it's going to be extremely interesting to take this perspective as one of the key transversal elements for the discussions we'll have for the following day and a half. So Massimo, welcome. Thank you very much and good morning to everyone. I would like to thank the World Bank, the National Institute of Statistics and the COLMEX for their invitation. For me, it is a great honor and pleasure to be here with you because I have been in this college several times before, and I want to remember the first time I came here almost 40 years ago when we organized the International Conference of Population with the USPIS, and I was the general director of the association by Silvia, the director of the college with Ramiro. Victor Luquiria was the director of the conference as well. So it's a very dear memory for me. So once again, thank you very much for having me. First of all, I'm a bit embarrassed about the idea of being kind of like in this key conference, and not kind of like the introductory presentation for all of these topics we'll be discussing, which would be perhaps more appropriate. But I will try to speak about an issue which is very, very complex. It has a double perspective. From a demographic point of view, just like Silvia has said, I've always worked on issues related to the population, even from a very interdisciplinary point of view, but also the perspective from a scholar. So I am not an officer for an international organization or for some state departments. I have no responsibilities from this perspective. A scholar perspective might be a bit more provocative, and that's what I've heard from some of my friends who've seen some of the slides that I am about to present to you, that I am a bit provocative. But I think you need to be provocative, but that's my scholar point of view, from the academia. I mean, we can provoke, we can mention things, but they're always from an intellectual point of view, so it's not dangerous at all, right? Having said that, my perspective is from a scholar point of view, a scholar that's worked in population-related topics, and the main or the key point that I want to develop is that among the goals for sustainable development, population has kind of disappeared. Population is one of the main characters, but it's not an explicit character, as if a bit more. I think it's important to give this point of view, this perspective, because I'm about to start working as a member of the audience, by remembering certain stage very, very shortly, because I don't want to spend too long discussing this. These are things that we all know, that we all remember. But there's an increasing growth for the development of population ever since the end of the Second World War. We realized that the population of certain countries in development are growing increasingly fast, and that's a problem for development. Strong Occidental countries have lost their colonies, have lost their control on over millions, centuries, and millions and hundreds and millions of population, and they're worried about this great demographic growth of what we know the third era. Also, international organizations are discussing this demographic topic as one of the key points for the development, especially of countries, of developing countries. Also, at a delegational level for international organizations, since 1974 in Bucharest, in 84 here in Mexico City, and in 94 in Cairo. And of course, afterwards, there have been hundreds of international meetings about this. I'm not going to mention them all, of course. But with the Cairo conference, they approved a World Action Plan regarding development and how to integrate population onto these several different key points, which will later on lead us to the announcement of the millennial goals in the year 2000. And you'd probably remember that there are 8 main goals. That we wanted to obtain between the years 2000 and 2015. Right now we're in 2016, so the years 2012, 2013 started with a lot of international meetings in order to discuss what the goals for the following 15 years would be. And here now we've gotten to the current 17 SDGs. One possible critic would be that it's too many goals. In the year 2000 we had 8 goals. Now we have 17 goals. In the year 2000 there were a limited, let's say, number of targets of goals, but now these targets are 169, and the indicators have been thousands in regards to the statistics that the director of the National Institute of Statistics has mentioned. Before there used to be quite few of them. I don't remember how many. But now it's over 300. I don't know if they've increased them over the past few years, but I believe that it's like 100, 200 or something like that. 230. Okay. So here we have part of the summary, the conclusion of the summit of the National Statistic Committee for the United Nations, their official announcement that assessed the 300 indicators, and here are the results. Many of these, it's impossible to calculate them. We have no methodology and no possibility of really obtaining these data, so they're useless. Some other ones are very difficult. We have to make excessive efforts, but it's not only a matter of techniques, because the Commission also said that many of these have no relevance, which is much worse than being incalculable. It means that they've inflated the number of indicators for any international association which might have interest for whatever topic, and they'd be able to just add them, no problems, would give them more indicators. So there would be no problem there. I mean, the worst thing comes, then we'll just won't calculate them, and that's it. So that's just kind of like the first problem here. That's just the critics. Yes, it's a provocation, as I've mentioned before, that I'd be making several of those. So that's for the world population. We all know what we're doing, what it's been done. There's some growth that it's decreasing. But there's sort of an international consensus, and that's what I want to get to. That says that population has been a problem in the past, but how this global growth rate has decreased at 2% at the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, and now it's at 1%. And we have a lot of evidence that this trend is going to continue decreasing. And it's possible that the world population is not stationary, but pretty much stationary, at least with some demographic behaviors that are compatible with the stationarity. So what is the problem here? Well, at the end of the century, it's close. There's 74 years before we get to the year 2100. So how are international organizations going to allow this new provocation? I kind of like putting the tainted glasses on, to see things differently. Let's say we want to be more optimistic. So, population is not a priority. But I do think it's a priority. I think it should be. There's an idea that demographic behaviors are more or less equal worldwide. So the differential parts between countries that have perhaps a very cheerful dynamics with their population growth and other countries are kind of becoming more and more equal. Where do we have a high rate of fecundity, a middle range of fecundity? Everything is now more or less becoming equal worldwide. Globalization is also going to cancel a bit, at least the biggest economic differences worldwide, and also international migration will decrease a bit. That's a little bit the future view, let's hope. But even if it did become this way, it will still pose a few problems that I'm going to discuss perhaps a bit later. Thus, if it is this way, we're kind of like at the end of demography. Because if everybody starts behaving in the same way, then if there's no international migration, we're going to lose our jobs, we're going to lose our positions, at least us demographers, There's going to be a whole world that is having a demographic revolution, so that our salary can change and be equal and prosperous, but well, I don't think right now we're at the end of demography. I think there's still several issues. I think the fecundity rates might be equal around the world, despite cultures, despite history, despite social structure of several countries. And I think that might be a bit more difficult than you think. There's a natural trend to this homeostasis. I think there are biological differences This is just kind of like a general principle that is really now going forth, and politics might decrease the differences among some countries, perhaps, maybe so, but it's not a guarantee. It might create a convergence between mortality, between the survival patterns. There will be a lot of optimism between the diffusion of biomedical diffusions in order for them to equal the mortality rate worldwide. Perhaps so. There will also be an end of migratory rates between different countries. Yes, it's very daring to think that that might be a possibility. I mean, that would be a very dull world, if there were no international migration. So, I don't think there will be an end to demography. The end of demography does not exist, at least for now. History tells us that the world distribution of the population has changed a lot. Here we have a small picture of the gaps between these continents through time. These reports are changing quite rapidly. Here we can see it. This is the weight of different continental areas and so since the 1700 until 1950. The blue line, for example, that just shots up, it's Africa. The other blue line that is going down, it's Europe, Western Europe. The red line that's a bit at the bottom, that's America. That wasn't as significant in the world, at least in the demographic perspective in the 1700s, and it's increasingly important now. So there are changes, there are many changes, and also believe this in the possible stationality. There will be certain centuries that does not match with different zones around the world, which means that we will continue to have a variety of different situations. I will now continue discussing the possible aspects of demographic development that might pose certain difficulties, certain milestones for development, and they might really become an obstacle for development. So they won't be sustainable, at least as sustainable as these trends are now. These trends then must be modified. There will be a need to impose certain social politics, economic politics, which would modify these points. Point number 1 and 2 are just speculations. These are the main cause for point number 3. There are over 2 billion people. $2 billion. I was just having difficulty saying it in Spanish. Because in Italian and in English it's billion, but in Spanish apparently there's not. So there are 2 billion people that have a very low rate of fecundity. And many of these have a low fecundity level, fertility level, because there are several countries, for example in countries in Europe such as Germany, Italy, Spain, their fertility is of perhaps 5% less than in the 1970s, and even more now. There's a part of Eastern Asia that has a really, really low fertility rate. China has great problems because of this fertility rate. The Chinese governments know that they have this problem and they need to have some systems of social perfection to change this, because it's a problem that is now triggering their attention in order to change these social and political aspects for the trend, which are extremely strong. And just like China, we have also countries like Thailand, we have Taiwan, we have South Korea. So quite a great part of Eastern Asia has a lot of problems regarding their future or long-term sustainability. Let's hope they can solve them. That is really one of the biggest problems. It's a great part of the mandate, or they might need policies in order to achieve this. Now, even now in Brazil, we were in a conference there. I was actually with Silvia there, a month ago at Brazil, and they have a problem with very low fertility in Brazil, and that's a problem that they're facing right now. Brazil used to be kind of like the highest fertility center in the world in the 60s. I mean, in Latin America, we talk about the shooting population of Brazil, that it was an increasing growth. And now the concern is actually quite the opposite. So it is possible for them to recover this fertility rate, to increase it. Of course, there's nothing fixed in stone regarding humankind, so let's hope an aversion takes place. However, I believe that the problem here is inflation, and that the low fertility rate will create even lower fertility rates, and so recovery might prove to be tricky. There's also the possibility of social reproduction, meaning that migration will somehow solve this problem of low fertility, but that is contradictory with the idea of international migration, which is going to decrease with the upcoming years. However, we think there might be some automatic mechanisms for recovery. What goes down must go up, or things of the sort. That this is something natural. There's some who might think that the low fertility rates might cause some issues with the economy, and it will then trigger a political reaction in order to attempt to modify sentences. There's a possibility of transferring certain courses from the oldest population to the youngest population regarding reproduction, but we also know that this is very difficult with the public finances state in almost all of the developed countries. Getting more resources means having to modify the division of these resources, and that's something, politically speaking, one of the hardest things to achieve. So I think that one of the countries with the lowest fertility rate, something that is not sustainable, is the link between the first and the second point of unsustainability, which is the extremely high rate of fertility in some areas of the world. That's what we would do perhaps with the evolution of the population in Germany, which is one of the most powerful country in Europe and the largest one, with the exception of Nigeria and Russia from 2015 to 2050. I mean, if we compare Germany and Nigeria, I mean, we can see it in this slide here. It's going to be less than 50% with the Nigerian population, which is going to grow 300% within the same social classes. So there is this problems, and that can at a long term create some difficulties. A second problem then is an extremely high rate or fertility rate. So now we have 7 billion people in the world, and 2 of these have an extremely high level of fertility, especially if we compare to the level of mortality. Like this mortality rate in a country as great as Nigeria, where we have 70 million inhabitants, we can see that their fertility rate hasn't really decreased in the past 23 years, while in the sub-Saharan area, the average of children have is over 5 kids. So the change in the past few decades have been extremely limited. it's been reduced only to certain specific social mediums. So even thinking now about a fecundity or fertility level that might be decreasing between now and the year 2050, the population in the sub-Saharan area is going to double up. And if nothing changes regarding fertility, then the population will change not from 1 billion to 2 billion. It's going to change from 1 billion to 3 billion. And these figures are very important figures. And I believe that this is something that must concern people who are studying this and who are treating this. I think there's a very important combination between the people with very high fertility in a grand part of this sub-Saharan area and in some very reduced parts of Asia, very, very reduced, and some ones in Latin America, I imagine, as well. And this might then endanger what we call the Malthusian Trap or the Malthusian Trap, which is a very old-fashioned idiom, you know. However, it's still standing, it's still strong. And it shows the problems of excessive growth of malnutrition, which is going to feed then these pathologies and will increase the mortality rates. And this relatively high mortality rate then won't allow fertility to go down, then the growth is going to be high, and this high growth is going to determine then another problem regarding this shortage of food, so a malnutrition problem, and this is going to be perpetuated throughout time. So we must break this. Now, in the Malthusian time, it was hard to break this. Nowadays, we have the medium, we have the resources, the financial resources, for the technological resources, for understanding and knowledge that will allow us to break this Malthusian trap. And I think it might be considered as something shocking, but if we don't break this trap, then we will have very serious sustainability issues in a great part of the world. And I think that should concern many international organizations explicitly. And I think that countries who are facing these difficulties shouldn't be offended by the fact that we are openly discussing the fact that they are part of a trap that must be broken and that they could break so long as they implement the necessary policies. Those are only some aspects of the Malthusian trap. That we have here that the ADER index, which is the adequacy dietary energy requirement, indicator of less than 120, then you see that you have a serious malnutrition problem in the country. So how do we see this in the sub-Saharan Africa? We've seen very few improvements over the past 20 years, ever since the beginning of the 1990s up to this past few years. So this is a problem, it's still a current problem, this trap. It's very, very closed. Another example might be with the children that are under the age of 5.
Sometimes children are wasted or stunted or underweight. And here we see that there are countries that have a lot of work to do. Fortunately, there are better results in other areas, but the problem in particular with India is that right now countries such as India have problems with undernourishment that are similar to the most impoverished countries of Africa. However, they have boosted their technological development. They have rocks in space. They have a streamlined technology. So that is why there is not consistency with that fact, and the fact that still a great majority of their children population is undernourished. And that is particularly related to fertility. Here we see that the TFR per woman in sub-Saharan Africa used to be of 6.5 children during the 50s, and right now it has decreased it to 5. Or at least that is according to the data from 2010-2015. So we see that there is a very low speed of decrease of the total fertility rate. The fourth point regarding to sustainability is, can there be sustainability with a natural sex ratio at birth as we see right now? Currently we see that the ratio is 120 boys per 100 girls. It should be 105 towards 106, and this is unethical, this is not acceptable, and it shows the low value that is given to women, and that is a very big problem. I don't think that this is part of the SDGs. This is not properly addressed in the SDGs. However, we think that it is a very touchy subject to discuss with China or with India, for instance, which are the countries that have the most disparity in gender. So it's important to identify that these trends are not sustainable and that we need more changes. And I'll stop here for this point. Unsustainability point number 5 is slightly more complex, and it is something that mostly all of us know about. And the problem is that if we want the impoverished world to duplicate or triplicate or to multiply by 5 or 6 times their per capita income during the next generation, that is going to create unsustainability from the perspective of the consumption of natural resources. And here's an example of that in 2 countries. One is Pauperia and the other one is Tycounia. And of course they are different countries, although here they seem to be only one by the when I wrote it. So let's think that Pauperia is in Africa and Tycounia is in Oceania. And let's think that the population is stationary and the per capita income will increase by 2%. This is only an example. In Pauperia, the population grows by 2%, and that's the growth that we expect during or for the next 30 years. Whereas in Tycounia, the population increases by 5%, and that has been more or less the trend. If the environmental impact is the result of the number of individuals who have a particular economic level and consumption rate, the impact by 250 in Pauperia would be twice the impact of 2014, whereas in Tycounia the impact would be 12 times as much in 2050 in contrast to 2014. That is in terms of non-renewable energy resources. And this is in the long term, and this is of course not sustainable, and that's why we are making so much emphasis on sustainability. What we want is for the world to be sustainable. We want for impoverished nation to be able to achieve growth. However, many of us are from a higher economic level. We might think that one more dollar in terms of per capita income could be used for cutting our hair, for us to look pretty, for us to buy a book, for us to obtain immaterial things. But for instance, what does a farmer do with one more dollar? They will buy fuel for their scooters or for their equipment. They're going to buy hand tools that are made of steel and which have a lot of minerals. So this growth is a type of growth that implies a lot of consumption of primary resources, and that will have a very important impact in natural resources. And of course, there is going to be also an impact in terms of policies. We need to decrease the value of P in our equation P times epsilon. So on the one hand, we know that decreasing the population may be useful. Additionally, the creation and dissemination of new technologies in the same countries should be particularly relevant, and it's not only a matter of these impoverished countries to be able to import the products, but of actually manufacturing themselves. This will allow us to address a lot of issues related to unsustainability, and I am talking in a non-sustainable way because I have a lot of material to cover and I only have 5 minutes. Unsustainability point number 6. That is the anthropization of the world. 10,000 years ago, when we learned how to grow crops, each inhabitant, which added up to a couple of million people, had a surface available that is as big as the island of San Fernando de Noronha. So they had a very vast area for growing crops for themselves. In a couple of years, each inhabitant on Earth will have a surface equivalent to the soccer camp of the island of Fernando de Noronha. That shows us how the world has, so to speak, shrinked, or either we are a little too many. But that poses other issues related to unsustainability. One of these issues related to unsustainability is the intrusion in pluvial forests and other fragile environments in the Amazon or in Congo, as well as in other parts of the world. And all these natural areas are important for the natural equilibrium and for the climate to be properly balanced. Additionally, the world population is concentrating in coastal areas rather than in non-coastal land. There is a very high growth in lying coastal areas, in low-lying coastal areas. And that poses a problem because, for instance, there wouldn't have been 200,000 victims of the tsunami in Southeast Asia if the population had not been so densely focused on a low-lying area. So this generates environmental fragility as well as numerous threats to the population in those regions. There is also an impact with regards to the big metropolis, and we see that here in Mexico City. We are in a valley and we have already seen what the impact of being in a low-lying area like this one is. And of course things are very different from the time that Cortés arrived here in the Valley of Mexico than now. We also have a very big issues related to pollution, particularly air pollution, because of the big and dense settlement in Mexico City. And this is a way in which I want to prove that the way that the population settles in certain areas poses problems related to sustainability. Now, this is the distribution of world land use. We see that they can be divided in a pristine state. This happened prior to the 17th century, and now more than half of the world is anthropicized. And this happens in cities. There are also commercial, residential developments, communication buildings, corporate towers. And there have been managed areas in which mankind has put its hands on. Additionally, we know that there are certain areas that are part of the tundra or the desert which are not inhabitable. So that is why each person in the future will be responsible for handling their own small plot of land that they own in a responsible way. And the last point for this presentation is international migration. And this is a topic that has been absolutely silenced in international fora. Out of the 169 targets for the Sustainable Development Goals, only 10.7 facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility of people. Awesome. But what does this mean? No one knows what this means. Who will be responsible for facilitation? Of course, not international organizations. International organizations favor coordination because they know that none out of the 196 countries of the world are willing to yield a little bit of their responsibility to an international organization. And I believe that this is a big problem, because there is also political and sustainability, not only social and sustainability regarding migration. And of course, there are forced displacements of humans caused by war, as well as some other issues. Of course, this is a pathological aspect of our society, but physiological migration is not something that can be dealt with from international organizations. And at present we see that no one is concerned about the enforcement of regulatory frameworks at the international level regarding migration. I think that this is an important issue that has become more important every year. In Europe, it's very clear to all of us that migration is a very important issue, and we know that there is also the Trump solution available, but we have yet to see if it's going to be a positive thing to do. And right now we see that there is an increased difference, an increased inequality gap between developed countries as well as other countries that are nearby. There are still very important differences between, for instance, Italy and North Africa, Japan and the Philippines. It's not so well seen between Mexico and the United States, but we see that there is a big difference between country to country. Additionally, we see that there is a very big inequality gap in terms of per capita income, in terms of purchasing power parity. And well, economists and experts in statistics seek to highlight the importance of indicators such as PPP. But the point is that the inequality gap between the rich and the poor has become increasingly bigger between the 50s and the years 2000. The difference between the rich and the poor was only of $10,000 in the 50s, whereas right now it means that the difference is approximately $400,000. And what does this mean? I don't really know, but the point is that inequality is still a very important thing nowadays. And as part of my closing remarks, I only want to read them because I don't think that they are so useful. I think that my remarks have already been made. There is no point in giving them again, but I believe that there are limitations to development due to population growth, and demographs still have the faith that they will be useful in society. Thank you. Thank you very much, Massimo, and now we will open a Q&A session. Thank you very much for such an interesting presentation, and my question, or rather my two questions are, according to you, what is the reason that demographic issues are not dutifully represented as part of the SDGs? And my second question is, if you had the power to do something, which objectives would you eliminate from the list and which ones would you add? And given that this is not a decision that you can make, what recommendations can you make? Well, the second question is really hard. And I think that I will abide by the Fifth Amendment. With regards to the first question, I'm not sure because I am not part of the organizations that are at the top of the international organization of the world. However, I think that the most touchy issues are political as well as social. I think that talking about abortion, talking about migration is a very touchy subject. And I believe that these are issues in which there is not a consensus at an international level, and that is why they are left as second-tier topics. That is why people are not willing to discuss them in depth. So maybe this is an interpretation as a scholar, but now with regards to the second question, perhaps I didn't hear all right, but can you explain the question? Could you rephrase your question, please? Yeah. During your presentation, You said that some of the indicators should not even be included. And so my question is, which indicators would you eliminate from the list, and which ones would you add to the list? Well, in terms of indicators, I would include indicators regarding international migration flows, because that is one of the areas that is hardest to analyze, because right now the figures that we have are well done, but their foundations are very weak. And I think that that would be a very important thing to do at an international level. There should be more effort in a deep analysis of the figures related to migration. Additionally, I believe that in the future, there could be a big possibility if we use the big data for analyzing mobility, because big data allow us to identify migration flows from one place of the world to another. So that is only an idea that has just come up. But maybe later on or at the end of this seminar, I will have a different answer for this question. Massimo, it was a pleasure to hear a lecture given by you. I would like to ask a question to draw upon your great expertise. And my question is related to the 7th topic about unsustainability, or the challenges about sustainability. You talked about unsustainable issues in a political arena, so you shifted your approach from the one that had characterized all your lecture, because you had talked about environmental and social unsustainability, but you shifted towards political unsustainability. Can you build a little bit on that? And maybe this is related to qualifying something as sustainability or not sustainability. And of course, a lot of political issues are related to social unsustainability. And then I have another question in that regard. And there are a couple of baselines for migration. But migration is not necessarily refuge seeking. Do you think that there could be questionings or more progress in the aspect of refuge in view of the present context? Well, of course, I didn't have enough time to talk about this issue in depth. And well, now the question was asked by Professor Francisco Alba, who has been responsible for the organization of the High Commission of Migration that was implemented or created by Kofi Annan approximately 10 years ago. And I believe that the final report issued by Secretary Annan has been left aside. And it is very clear to all of us that there is political unsustainability in terms of the lack of order of migration flows. And I believe that this lack of coordination also shows in the political relations between one country and another. This is also a political issue because no other country is willing to yield only a little piece of their sovereignty in terms of migration, because migration implies a change in the social structure of a country. And from the social perspective, I believe that a problem is the lack of mediation between exporting countries of migrants, so to speak, and the countries that receive migrants. And the comparison I can make is to the WTO. The WTO has the possibility of making countries abide by an international framework in terms of trade. However, there is no such thing in terms of migration. And I think that it was your office that recommended the creation of a facility in which the different UN agencies would collaborate in the topic of migration. That could already be a very positive channel for communication and coordination. However, that doesn't exist at the moment, and it is a very important issue to deal with in the near future. I could continue talking about this, but maybe our audience would get bored. Any other questions? Good morning. Thank you very much for such an interesting lecture. And sometimes we ask you questions which do not necessarily have an answer. But I think that we should ask ourselves something about communication. How do we get the message across to the population that the international community is seeking sustainable goals? How do I talk about this to all the people I meet on the streets from all walks of life? How do I convince them that the international agenda is focusing on sustainable development? I am a professor at the Interactive Museum of Economy, and I see that there is a very big challenge with regards to sharing the information about the SDGs to other colleagues. Or for instance, how can I talk about sustainable development goals to faraway communities? How can I tell them that one of the objectives is to promote their culture and to promote their products when it is a very big challenge in itself to define what the sustainable development goals are? Now, I abide by the Fifth Amendment once again. I see the problem, I see what you are saying, but I think that this is a problem that is very difficult to solve. Sometimes individual interests or the interests of a small community go against the interest of the general population. I believe that there are important things with regards to individual behaviors, and right now the message that is spreaded throughout the world with regards to sustainability seeks to catch the attention of the general population of children at schools, for example. I believe that schools are essential in the communication of these messages. However, I think that it's very important not to put the blame on individuals for what is happening. We need to have a neutral standpoint in this regard, and it's not a matter of saying if you do this you are a good citizen, if you are not a good citizen it's because you're doing this and that. We shouldn't be too moral about this. And this is very important because people are not interested about vain speeches. Right now, people understand that political speeches, for instance, are vain in contrast to a reality that has a lot of problems. So that is something that we should do. We should focus on not giving a vain speech. There is yet another question. This will be the last question for this session. Thank you very much for your outstanding key lecture. And I want to be provocative with the comment I am about to make. We should pay attention to the history of demographic dynamics. We need to analyze what has happened with human populations and how human populations have been governed. Sometimes there have been demographic ruptures, or perhaps we have fallen into the Malthusian traps. What the history of the populations tell us is that the longer raising awareness takes, the more inhuman and more brutal responses are. The history of China talks to us about this, the history of India, the history of some populations in the American continent. Because in the attainment of these Millennium Development Goals, there is the possibility of implementing inhumane measures. And I have a last question as well for you to give your closing remarks, and it's not connected to this, but what do you think about Latin America? Because Latin America is to some extent in the middle. So now I yield the floor to you for your last intervention. Well, with regards to Latin America, Latin America is a continent that, in spite of everything, has less problems than the other parts of the world. What's the reason for this? I wouldn't know. It's very clear to me that there is a base culture, so to speak. There is a common ground, culturally speaking. Additionally, the demographic culture has not been homogeneous, but not as much as the case of other countries. Sometimes I believe that there are more disparities inside the countries than among the countries of the region. That is why I think that it is very important to focus on the work of each individual government collaborating as a whole, rather than doing something to improve how governments are working internally. I have studied about Latin America, but in colonial times, at a superficial level, because I am not a historian. But I believe that inequality is more consistent at an internal level than an external level. And of course, there are a lot of disparities. Particularly due to the higher rates or the more numerous indigenous population. That could be one of the issues that causes internal fractures. And now, with regards to the inhumane solutions in the long term, what do you mean? Do you mean to say that there is a very bold and very stringent solution For instance, in the case of China with the one-child policy, is that what you mean? It's a question. It's a question for the person who asked the provocative one. Yes, that's what I meant. Sorry, this needs to be the end of our session. A round of applause, please, to our key lecturer.